Great. So I'm in the first 4 months of a PhD that's looking at the origins and history of whiskey distilling. And because I'm in my first 4 months, I don't have an enormous amount to say about the entire subject. But what I really want to talk about today is something that's really bothered me so far. And it's the fact that we, these days, look at whiskey as a national drink. And when you classify something as national, you say something about ownership and identity. And when we go back in time and look at whiskey, I think that becomes very complicated and not true. And we don't really understand where whiskey comes from. So this is going to be a talk of 3 parts. I'm going to give you a really quick history of whiskey and where it comes from. Then I'm going to talk about how we look at stills in the landscape, how we identify them. And then the larger part is about why I think it's an anthropologically interesting subject. So, first context we have is really in monasteries. And it's seen as a sort of spiritually significant process to distill alcohol and also a source of income for monasteries. But the first written record we have of whiskey, which is as aqua vitae, is in 1494, and it's 8 balls of malt to Friar John Core wherewith to make aqua vitae for the king, who is James IV, and he uses it for ordnance. He likes to make things explode by adding alcohol to gunpowder. But he's not just like a sort of Jeremy Clarkson figure, because he's very interested in the spiritual aspect as well. And he actually believed that distillate was the physical embodiment of the 5th element. And by distilling, he brought himself and science closer into a direct communion with God, kind of like that. And so, thank God someone left. So, the next sort of improvements we've got is the Guild of Surgeon Barbers are given a monopoly, and that shows us that it's probably a tonic. It's being used medicinally. And then in the middle of the 16th century in Europe, we start to get water cooling of still worms, which means that distillate passes through a pipe and gets condensed really quickly. It's very efficient. And then at the end of the 16th century, we've got earls, barons, lords, and gentlemen getting a monopoly on whiskey distilling, which means, and that's because of grain shortages. So it means that it's a widespread enough social practice that they're having to limit who is able to do it in times of national crisis. In the 1690s, after the Jacobite uprisings, Duncan Forbes of Culloden is given the privilege of distilling tax-free, and that's in payment for helping to put down Popist uprisings. So while it's often a Jacobite identity drink, in later years it actually starts as a very Protestant drink. And this is like an early form of branding, really. People stop saying whiskey for a while and say Farintosh, even if it's not from there. A little bit like how in later years people said Glenlivet instead of whiskey sometimes. It's a really difficult thing to do to stop people distilling illicitly, which is happening after the Jacobite uprisings, especially after the Forfeiture Acts. People now have to pay cash rents, and that's really problematic for them. And where they were distilling whiskey and often paying rent in part with whiskey, they now have to sell it. In 1782, there's the Highland Line brought in, and that creates a condition for smuggling. But it's often not really enforced. Justices of the peace really like whiskey. They need to sell grain. A lot of them are farmers. And also, a lot of people who are in court are their tenants, and they don't necessarily want to lose their rent by having them in prison. So that's it does become a sort of a cheeky exploit. People, after Culloden, they start to associate whiskey with Jacobite identity. And I'm going to talk later about the idea of these small acts of resistance and how they play into a bigger picture. So now I'm going to talk very briefly about stills in the archaeological record. This is the Canmore result for Speyside. There aren't many there, and we know that in some of these glens, thousands of stills were being seized in 1 year. So it's very underrepresented. And the way that we really identify a still is by looking at where it is in the landscape. It has to be somewhere hidden, and it has to be somewhere that you can have a lookout nearby. And it's also, you're going to have a set of diagnostic features, so a way to bring water in and out of the still. And Michael Given published this. Sorry, that's a still site in Glen Urquhart. I think it lacks a lot of diagnostic features, but it's recognized by many people as a still site. It could be a lump of grass, but it's very well recognized as a still site. This is Michael Given's morphology. It's actually very useful, but this is completely, this has illicit distilling. That bothy is huge. It would be very easily recognized, so it would have to be very well hidden. So I'm going to talk about why I think this is anthropologically interesting. We're going through a period of change, and we're seeing capitalism becoming a force in the Highlands. And I think moving from peasant distilling to corporate distilling is really a process of alienation in a very sort of classical Marxist sense. So the first thing I've thought about is James C. Scott's Weapons of the Weak and Domination in the Arts of Resistance. It's a relatively low-risk activity. Often fines are paid communally, and it's a way to sort of just risk it a little bit and probably get away with it. And it also brings in money while subverting the wishes of a landowner and the wishes of the legal system. But more importantly, I think, is the idea that we're transforming from an agrarian society, well, an agro-literate polity, as Gellner would have said, to a nationalist, industrialist society. We're actually probably, if we're talking about developmentally, we're not really agro-literate, but in the case I'm going to talk about in a moment, it probably works quite well. And a very significant part of this is you educate your family in farming and how to get the best out of your farm and your grain, and you have community connections all feeding into your still, and that educates you over a very long period of time into how to conduct these quite complicated processes. But with a period of nationalism and industrialization, you get exo-socialization, where people are educated out with the home and out with the family. And they're basically given an education that means that they can pick up a manual and learn how to do something. And this is when whiskey really changes. So, this is John Murdoch, and some of you might be familiar with him. He was a land reform agitator, a socialist, a campaigner, and an exciseman. So he spent quite a lot of his career trying to root out illicit distilling. And he really hated John Ramsay of Islay because he actually took away distilling and made it into an industry. And he hated alcohol anyway. But I think there's an argument for saying what these people really hated about alcohol in this industry is that it had been alienated from people who had actually possessed all of the products of their labor. But he also talked very specifically about John Ramsay and education and the way that he trained people to work in his stills also took them away from their culture. And I wish I had a bit more time to go into that. But anyway, so this is the sort of concluding comments. I think that whiskey distilling does provide an opportunity to study identity and labour in the Highlands, especially at the sort of changing time between the end of Culloden and the start of the 20th century. It can be used to sort of look at Ernest Gellner's ideas of transferring into a sort of nation-state with an industrial mode of production. And I think the study of diversity of still sites can tell you a lot about distilling as a practice in small, contained regions. And I'd just like to thank my supervisors at UHI. Thank you very much.